Just give me the whiteboard.
Got it.
So we're going to start clearing up some of the upper extremity arterial supply questions. So we start at the heart, and the first branch off the heart is the aorta from the left ventricle. On the right side of the body, the first branch of the aorta is this thing called the brachiocephalic trunk. Brachio referring to the arm, cephalic referring to the head, because it's got two branches. The right common carotid artery, which is going to eventually branch into the internal and external carotid artery to supply the face and the skull, and eventually the internal surface of the skull and the brain. So we'll talk about those later. The other branch of the brachiocephalic is the subclavian. Subclavian is going to be our main distributor to the upper extremity and scapular region. There's no brachiocephalic trunk on the other side. The common carotid and subclavian arteries just branch right off of the aorta. So in other words, we're staring from an anterior view. We're going to look at the right side of the body here. So the subclavian artery is the other branch from the brachiocephalic. And we separate that into three parts. And it's relative to where the anterior scalene muscle is. So let's call this the anterior scalene muscle. There's a part of the subclavian artery that comes off before proximal to the anterior scalene. There's a part that's deep to the anterior scalene, and there's a part that is distal. So the first branch off of the subclavian artery ascends in the transverse frame of the cervical vertebra, C1 through 6, and that's the vertebral artery. Vertebral artery is going to be a big blood supply to the brain, and so it's going to enter the foramen magnum and combine with the vertebral artery on the other side to form the basilar artery. And then ascending from the first part of the subclavian downward, that's the internal thoracic artery. Internal thoracic artery is going to be found on the internal surface of the ribs, and it's going to supply the first 6 intercostal spaces with the anterior intercostal arteries. And it splits into the superior epigastric and the musculophrenic arteries. Musculophrenic artery contributes down the lateral side of the ribs to the rest of the anterior intercostal arteries, and the superior epigastric is found deep to the rectus abdominis, still superficial to the abdomen. And then the last, off the first part of the subclavian, the last trunk is called the thyrocervical trunk. It's named that because it has a branch that goes to the thyroid gland and some branches a branch that goes to the neck. So the branch that goes to the thyroid gland is called the inferior thyroid artery. And then we have the transverse cervical. Transverse cervical artery. We're not going to talk too much about the inferior thyroid artery. We'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about the thyroid gland, but the transverse cervical artery is going to be found deep to the trapezius muscles, traveling with the spinal accessory nerve. And then lastly here from this trunk, we have the suprascapular artery. Suprascapular artery descends posterior and inferior to go to the scapula, and when it gets to the superior transverse scapular ligament, it goes over the ligament, and the suprascapular nerve goes under the ligament. The two meet up to sit in the supraspinous fossa, and then eventually the infraspinous fossa. So that's the first part of the subclavian artery. Then we go deep to the anterior scalene muscle, and we have a trunk called the costocervical trunk. Costocervical trunk, named that because it has one branch that goes to the ribs and one branch that goes to the neck. The one that goes to the neck is called deep cervical. It's just like it sounds. It's deep in the posterior neck, in sort of the muscular compartments of the neck. And the one that goes to the ribs is called the supreme intercostal. Supreme intercostal just supplies the blood to partially to the first two intercostal spaces. So then the subclavian artery travels distally. Now we're past the anterior scalene, distal to the anterior scalene. And the last branch of the subclavian artery is called the dorsal scapular artery. And the dorsal scapular artery is going to be found on the medial border of the scapula, traveling with the dorsal scapular nerve, which innervates the rhomboid major and minor and levator scapula. So you're going to find it on the medial border of the scapula. This happens about 70% of the time. There's other anomalies where the dorsal scapular artery comes off of the transverse cervical, but for our purposes, we'll just say it comes off of the third part of the subclavian artery. So then the subclavian artery gets to the rib cage, and it crosses over the first rib. And it changes its name. And it changes its name to the axillary artery. So now this is axillary. And similar to the subclavian artery, we have three parts. We have a part that is proximal to a muscle, a part that's underneath a muscle, and a part that's distal. And the muscle itself is the pectoralis minor. So part 1 there, proximal to it. Part 2, deep to the pec minor, and then part 3, distal to the pec minor. The first branch off of the axillary artery, which is the only one off of the first part, is called the superior thoracic. Which supplies blood to the first two intercostal spaces, similar to the supreme intercostal. Then we go deep to the pec minor, and we have two branches here, or two arteries here. Number 1, it's called the lateral thoracic. Lateral thoracic artery travels with the long thoracic nerve on the external surface of the rib here, sort of where the serratus anterior would be. And then we have a pretty large trunk coming deep to the pec minor. It's called the thoracoacromial trunk. Thoracoacromial trunk. T-R-U-N-K. Which has 4 branches to it. And it's the California Police Department. C-A-P-D. Clavicular artery, acromial artery, pectoral artery, and deltoid artery. So the pectoral artery is one we've seen in lab. It travels with the lateral pectoral nerve. And then we have the clavicular, acromion, and deltoid, just named for where they're going to end up, where they're going. And that's the second part of the axillary artery. And then the last part of the axillary artery, the third part, there's 3 branches. There's a branch that goes medially. It's called the, you're going to get mad at me if I do that. Hold on. I'm going to keep colors consistent. I don't want people getting mad at me. It's called the subscapular artery. The subscapular artery is only an artery for a very short period of time because it splits pretty quickly into 2 arteries. The first one is called the scapular circumflex. Scapular circumflex artery is going to be found in the triangular space, making its way around the dorsal part of the scapula to contribute to the scapular anastomosis. And then the other artery that's a branch of the subscapular artery is the thoracodorsal. Thoracodorsal. Thoracodorsal artery is going to be found deep to the latissimus dorsi muscle, traveling with the thoracodorsal nerve, which innervates the latissimus dorsi muscle. So the subscapular artery is only an artery for a short period of time, not to be confused with the suprascapular artery. Totally different arteries. Then off the other side of the third part of the axillary artery, we have 2 circumflex arteries. We have an anterior and a posterior humeral circumflex. So we have posterior humeral circumflex and anterior humeral circumflex. We know the posterior humeral circumflex, we saw that in lab, it's traveling through the quadrangular space with the axillary nerve. These two are going to be wrapping around the proximal humerus. And then the axillary artery changes its name once it gets by the teres major muscle. This is teres major. And change its name to the brachial artery. And that's to be continued. Thank you.